Good morning from Chicago. Thanks for having me, and very much appreciate you guys continuing to do these things because indeed we're all living in unprecedented times, and I don't think anything is any more the same. And so, being able to do these things like we would have under normal circumstances is actually a blessing. So much appreciated, and I hope I can make it worth your time and for the folks who are participating in the seminar. Uh, Indeed, it's a hot topic. As much as I'm always a little worried about speaking about topics like these because these are very used terms, highly, I would say, debatable in certain circumstances. In some cases, overused. Talk about big data came and went. We talked about AI and ML 30, 40 years ago, and we're back with it now. I'm always careful to not make myself look like some rocket scientist who understands the nitty-gritties of all the stuff that's out there. But at the same time, indeed, working on these subjects is a privilege in many ways because these are the things that will shape our future. If they've already begun to shape our future. And what used to be somewhat impossible, even not comprehensible, even a decade ago has now become pretty much routine. I come from the aviation space. I'm a passionate aviator myself, and GPS technology used to be the domain of the airlines, the commercials, and the military space. Today, we have more GPS power on our smartphones than we had even on large machines just about a decade and a half, 2 decades ago. So change is happening rapidly, and indeed, it's a fascinating space to be in at any point in time. But to get to work on these things in the arena we're in is indeed a privilege, and I take it as a blessing. I will keep the conversation to the minimum to allow for Q&A at the end. I'll also perhaps, I don't have technical slides here. I'm a hardcore technologist, and I'm a software engineer by academics. But I've tried to keep this at that level where I want to talk to you all about what's happening within Fulcrum, where our focus is, what we are working on, where our customers are asking us for help. And Deepak and Sandeep just spoke to some topics that perhaps resonate. I don't think any of the terms I will use in this deck are going to show up as special or new. I'm certain all of us are in this, in the realm of marketing and digitizing marketing and or supplementing it or complementing it with AI or ML would have talked about these things before. But I'll give you my flavor to it, to give you some sense for where we are and what we are doing. So Fulcrum essentially, of course, is just a digital transformation firm. We focus purely on digital transformation. We are 21 years in the making. And what we have continued to do is evolve ourselves just like stuff is evolving. And things become more legacy quicker now than ever before. We continue to evolve ourselves as well. So coming to the marketing realm and what we are doing for customers or where we're being asked for help, I think it just goes back to this one slide and the next slide itself. It summarizes the situation we are in. And until now, we used to get to ask the question of a powerful computer. And if we knew pretty much what to ask for, the system could provide us an answer. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quicker, but we would get an answer. If there was the data built into a database of any kind, and if we knew what to look for, I think there are enough systems that got built which could respond to a query in some form, or the other. I think what's changed fundamentally from a technologist standpoint is that today we perhaps are able to ask the question to the computer to ask us to tell us what to ask for. I think that's the fundamental shift that's happened in terms of what's changed within AI and ML. As I grew up, the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, I heard the term AI/ML when I came to study in the US many, many years ago. I would be dating myself here, but 30, 35 years ago, this was being spoken about. So it's not entirely new. There are some things that have changed in the time period over the past decade, mostly than before. But the ability to allow the machine to learn what's in the data set it's been provided, and then come up with even telling us to ask for something that we perhaps would not have comprehended, I think is a fundamental shift. Too often, I will say this from my perspective, I still look at all of us asking What questions can I get responses for? I flip that question around most of the time to say, what can I learn from the machine to even know what to ask for? That, if we shift deeply and diligently, I think will promote us into a very different league of things than we have ever seen in the past. In my opinion, this is the one big shift that's happened over the time period in the last decade, 2 decades. The fact that machines can learn, the fact that they can tell us what to ask for that we may have never thought about asking is fundamentally what it is. Unstructured data is where all this stemmed from. The challenge with AI ML, even as we spoke about it in the 70s, the 80s, was that we truly had no ability to deal with unstructured data at the volumes they presented, the algorithmic space that they created, and the ability to go even do something with that data. So from the standpoint of AI ML, someone asked me if ML is new. I would say absolutely no. I think we've done this in a variety of ways over the years that have gone by. In terms of what has all contributed, low-cost compute, I think, has significantly contributed to what AI ML have become over the years. In fact, the ability that we can access high-powered compute at low cost in a utility-type model, I think, is one of the fundamental things. Cloud elasticity, the ability to draw as needed and let go when not needed, perhaps is the second big thing that's changed in the ambience we live in. The environment provides us so much elasticity now that one doesn't need to have the supercomputer sitting in your backyard for doing any of this. I'm a passionate aviator, as I said, and I do build flight simulators for passion. One of the things that I came across just about 6 weeks ago was an email from a small startup that reached out to every professional flight sim hobbyist or professional, actually, and said, hey, can you lend some of your compute cycles for a cause to deal with COVID-19? They were trying to research patterns in the appearances of COVID and whatnot. And without going into much detail, the email to me was a big thing because somebody had started to leverage across a distributed scenario, compute sitting idle on all of our computers sitting at home for the most part. If you're not using them, they're just idling their time away. Leaving them on would allow them to actually use it for detecting patterns in terms of hotspots for COVID. And so it came in a week after the whole shelter-in-place lockdowns began. And it just amazed me that within a week, somebody had started to generate enough compute power in an elastic way that your computer could be used for doing something as important as what they were trying to accomplish at that time. It still is ongoing. And it is a fascinating thing for me to see. The fact that elasticity can be combined with compute is not a new concept, but its implementation is relatively new, even though it's not completely rampant or being used by everyone. It's out there. Utility-based models, as I talked about, ubiquitous access, I think, is the other one. As I said just now, you don't need to be sitting someplace to go do this. You could be anywhere. And we have all finally gotten to even operating remotely, which is a highlight of what's gone on in the last 10 weeks, despite all the negative aspects of what's gone on. There are some learnings. There are some teachings that came out of this. I think people have learned to adapt and adopt faster. And then the fact we're all operating the way we are is indeed a fascinating way to know the resilience of the human side. High-speed processors available to anyone who want to use it. And then, of course, the ability to divide and conquer a problem. I think all of these have come across as primarily being contributors to dealing with AI and ML and how they become rampant with time. I don't want to go through the subject of what is AI ML, but I want to reorient ourselves for the rest of this discussion. I think enough has been discussed since morning around AI ML. There's enough buzz around the subject. So I don't want to come across as trying to educate anyone on what AI or ML is on this session. But generally, to just get ourselves back to what Fulcrum believes it's operating off, so we get our definitions clear. It's a subset of AI machine learning. And then we absolutely have the opportunity to have algorithms that can learn, which is an aspect of ML. ML distinguishes itself from AI primarily because AI allows for automated intelligence, but then ML is the hard source of preceding that intelligence. We need to learn something before we can actually go intelligently apply it. And so you can comprehend humanly and then apply heuristics or rules to create it, or have algorithms that learn. The ability to look for patterns, like this example I gave you earlier, I think is a fascinating thing. The human mind can comprehend a few, but there is a limit to it. The ability for machines to comprehend more clearly and holistically, I think, is the finer aspect of where ML comes into play. The fact that there's not a whole lot of effort that's needed, instruction that's required to advise, especially in unsupervised type learning, the ability for ML to go conquer large patterns, in very large data sets, to be able to come back and advise us on what it's finding, is almost an intrinsic way of figuring out how not to tell the system to be limited, but how to allow it to be unlimited, how to allow it to be infinite to the extent that it's powered up with the ecosystem around it that provisions such intelligence. The insights aspect that Deepak spoke about, I missed the earlier one than that, but he spoke about insights and the ability to real-time insights, and I think that's a very prominent aspect of anything we want to do. The term actionable intelligence is not brand new. I think actionable intelligence came about a long time ago, and the ability to remove excuses out of anyone's life in terms of I didn't know what to do even though I knew about it, and then I didn't know how to act in time. I think those three questions have always been an issue with driving either business behavior and or personal behavior. And so at all levels in the realms that we operate in, the ability to have actionable intelligence that can truly power up these insights into actions, I think is a fascinating aspect of AI and ML. The fact also remains that you don't have to define data sets or data streams. You can allow it to operate on what it's finding. And yes, indeed, many a times that I go through many, many data sets, you find that there is no correlation between airspeed and landing weight. You don't find any correlation between flight delays and time of day. You may find a correlation clearly between targeted consumerism in the world of marketing and consumer purchases. You could find correlations between weather and flying patterns. The fact, of course, given the fact that we're doing this presentation today, we have to say any algorithm is only as good as what it's learning. And so the fact that we are in such an unprecedented circumstance now may have a situation for some time where what we have learned from the data sets we have gathered, other than prior crises type data sets, we may be skewed in what we are looking at as insights. That could potentially happen for some time. But with time, of course, you gain and gather more and more time, more and more data. And with data, naturally, the intelligence continues to grow and gets better with time. But the fact it can detect what it's finding as patterns is the promising aspect of both ML and then power it up to AI. The limit aspect I spoke about, my experience in terms of working on this for several years now is that you don't want to limit what it's trying to find. The minute you limit it, you're applying your intelligence on top of it. And then you may be eliminating opportunities to find something that the system may have found, other than being limited through hardware, compute, elasticity, storage, memory, those kinds of technical constraints. Perhaps going unsupervised or even supervised and allowing a data set to grow with time is perhaps the best way to do it, while keeping your focus on a certain set of objectives. Unfocused, objective-driven learning perhaps doesn't fetch as much, so you want to stay focused on the objective. Going back to talking about marketing for a little bit. So it's a combination between the mind and the machine. Yes, there needs to be oneness between doing both. Otherwise, you'll have one or the other take over. So indeed, there's some amount of integration or synergy between having the mind and the machine work together. There are a certain set of key topics that we talk about a heck of a lot. Predictive intelligence, predictive sciences, analytics, dashboards, standard verbiage that we come across in the world of business that we operate in. And so those are continuing trends. I think what's improving with time is the fidelity of what you're observing as intelligence, I think, is improving. Analytics have been around. It started doing reporting back in the days when compute started, mid-60s, 70s. And so reporting turned into finding analytics that could behoove action. And so they go hand in hand. If you have intelligence, then you must have action result from it. So naturally, analytics are a good way of driving it. Finding the right measures and metrics, applying it to drive behavior in a certain way, I think is the important thing, because having meaningless metrics or less meaningful metrics, you may have the measures, you may have the analytics, but they perhaps will not do much in terms of changing an outcome for the situations being applied to. We've talked about this, in terms of the SMAC stack many years ago, social, mobile, analytics, and cloud. And I know we talk about quantum computing today in the same realm. But sharing, I think, has become the norm. I know social distancing is very active right now, but sharing information, allowing for data sets to be groomed, allowing for insights to be gathered, and there is a lot more of that happening than ever before. There is an element of proprietariness that needs to be maintained with whatever we do. Otherwise, there is no competitive advantage. But then the element of sharing insights has become the norm. I think it's turning and catching up to be the trend across everything and anything we do. Personalization, not a new word again. I will say I think we've dealt with personalization for many years. Mass customization is another term that came about. But indeed, the only way to know what your market deserves or requires is either ask them. And in most cases, we find asking itself changes human behavior. Human psychology has been found to alter the minute you ask somebody a question or when they're under observation. So if you're trying to find out whether the latest introduction of a product, whether people like Coke Zero or not, if you were to really go poll people and ask them the question, I think the responses that you would find would be very different than if you were to know from unstructured means as to what people say when they're talking about nutrition and or soda and or zero-calorie products and so forth. Likewise with anything, the new smartwatch or a handheld GPS device or a bunch of headphones, anything you take into the marketplace, finding ways to understand whether the reactions to the product are one way or the other are best observed from secondary basis and unstructured terms. If you were to directly go polling or asking, naturally you'll find answers that may inhibit the actual result or not demonstrate the skew within the data set. This is, of course, something we find in many data sets that we run in our labs across a variety of industries. Content curation and creation and curation should go. Are also not new terms, but I think what is empowered now as an adaptive learning systems, where if your content is being repurposed across a kinesthetic, auditory, or a visual learner, you'll find that the use of content, as you market it back to the student, even though it's not active marketing, when you put it back in the hands of the student, you'll come to know really quickly which of these are being consumed in what ways, which of these are more effective in achieving a student's outcome. This could apply to any product. Student content, learning content is only one example, but it could apply to any other product. But the ability to curate content and feedback that goes with it so that we can come back and repurpose products in a far more meaningful way, I think has become the norm across the world of digitized marketing and consumption. The topic of internet marketing will never be complete without speaking about voice. I have, two sides of me, when I come to this subject. I'm not yet sure, although we have had telematics in cars and Bluetooth devices and now on our smartphones, you can talk to them and the Alexas of the world. I'm not certain yet in my own mind because data doesn't indicate it yet in a sense where it's statistically significant. But voice-powered anything is actually a hot subject. A lot of people like voice, and they're naturally, you can't leave it out of the marketing channel base that you go out to. But in the industries I've worked in or I've come from, even in personal use for that matter, it's very hard to in fact say voice has actually worked out. We have had IVR systems for many, many years, and IVRs became from button to voice a long time ago. But indeed, after a while, you just want to get rid of the IVR system and then go back to talking to a human being. Why? That's because you get a reaction. You get an instant answer. I think voice will take its own course to becoming a meaningful channel for marketing, anything. But it's definitely, no discussion is complete without speaking about voice. So we will have it in here. The ability to have voice-based search, though, I think is the advantage there is to have an NLP-based searching, which research finds that the ability for humans to speak into something about what's on their mind in terms of search is far more powerful than having to write it down with a bunch of words and phrases. Machine learning in marketing, we'll talk about this topic a little bit. I think what we have found in our work within the labs and with our customers is they go hand in hand. I think the machine without the human is not complete. And naturally, marketing and human behavior are very tightly integrated. A bulk of the dominance in marketing comes out of being able to analyze psychology. Who's buying? What are they buying? When will they buy? How likely are they to buy? At what price point are they most likely to dive into something? When does a product become not so meaningful? Back at the airline, I used to work for United Airlines a long time ago, and a bulk of my career is in aviation. In fact, we used to do yield management systems, and I worked across several aspects of the aviation ecosystem. And one of the things we used to do without any of these powerful gadgetry that we have today, we had none of the low-cost compute devices, nor did we have anything to deal with big data as we call it today. But we had large databases in aviation, even when I was there many, many years ago. I still work there in the aviation space, but a lot has changed in that space. Even back then, we used to go out finding how do you detect consumer behavior? How do you know a $1 increase in pricing on a ticket will stick? And we would find that if we would edge it up $5 at a time and find out what happens, and consumer behavior would immediately shift. We could tell when we were losing tickets or ticket sales, even in the days of travel agencies. And so now with direct-to-consumer marketing, it's far more easier to, in fact, talk about this, human behavior integration, because we can almost feel it. We sense it. We find out faster. We know when they're on it, we know when they're not on it. We know when they pick on things and when they let go of the cart, to Deepak's point, an abandoned cart. So we find a lot of the reaction, the feedback coming back in a whole lot quicker than it ever did in the past. But once again, not a new concept by any means, but definitely a new way to moving forward and implementing an idea or a solution to bring them together. The basis for any of this is insights. What do we know, and where does that come from? A large data set and an ongoing upkeep of that data set, which is where perhaps the struggle is. How do you keep a data set relevant as change happens with the velocity that it's happening now? I think the velocity of change is faster than it has ever been before. And what happens with that is keeping up becomes harder, and you can't be driving a car looking into the rearview mirror. So when you're looking out of the front windshield, you have to somehow have a good enough crystal ball to detect patterns and understand what may be coming. And so data sets become the dominant failure point. If it's not up to date, if it's not large enough, skews will result, because in the world we are in today, statisticians are not sitting on the side figuring out what they're learning from the data sets. This is happening in real time most of the time. And as data sets get improved, actions get improved, outcomes change, behavior changes, approaches change, and marketing will change as well. So who you go after, what are you pricing it at, what do you learn from it, how do you take any feedback, will they click, not click on an item? All of these become far more higher velocity, and with velocity, then naturally what turns into legacy also is a much quicker outcome. Today, we find most things turn legacy faster than ever before. The word legacy at one time meant 25 years of usage. Today, I don't think many things last 25 months. They keep changing more rapidly than that. So this depends entirely on how good your insights are and how far out you can forecast something. But at the same time, that is inherently based off what data sets you're drawing from and how up-to-date those data sets are. So from a machine learning and marketing synergy, naturally there's a direct and very simplistic synergy, as we've just talked about it. I think the synergy is only valid if you can bring them together in a meaningful way. The advantage with the real-time character of what we find today is that product marketing and product development, in fact, get addressed in a very different way than before. Feedback comes in faster, so products evolve quicker, and most of the time, you notice products taking shape with weeks of feedback. It doesn't even need months of feedback. And that agility is where true business agility comes in. That's where true product agility comes in. I also have the privilege of heading a product development at Fulcrum, and we listen to our customers very, very frequently through all kinds of channels, not the one-time customer group that people used to belong to. And we amend all aspects of our product lines, our platforms, the componentry that we put together, real-time accelerators that we have in place, the entire business platform, the core business platform philosophy, agility and aggregation of solutions for customers. We do that at a pace far faster than ever before. It's daunting on one side because how do you keep products moving forward at that pace? But whether it's possible or not, the market expects it. And there's a natural inherent limit to it. Nothing can be infinitely fast. But at the same time, it is getting faster by the day. And unless companies listen to customers and listen to feedback and watch these insights carefully, I don't think that products can be at the edge of the envelope as it needs to be to remain in a competitive marketplace. I think direct consumer targeting has become one of my favorite topics because this is where most of the action happens. This is where most of the feedback comes. This is where you learn the most. This is where you perhaps can curate recommenders for the customers the most. And having access into directly into the consumer allows, I think, for us to understand that human psychology aspect much better. So in everything we try to do, as much as possible, we try to find our ways into understanding the end user to the extent that we know why or when they may do something, whether today or tomorrow, it shouldn't matter. But naturally, we want to understand the end consumer's perspective on most things. And these snippets of data that we get, which are all over the internet, a bulk of what successful companies do today comes out of being able to understand and curate ideas and recommendations based on consumer feedback or consumer thinking. With that data, then naturally you're able to personalize because now you're able to address CP Jois's needs much better than someone else's. You can go after Ritesh's future purchases and determine whether he or she would want to buy it. I think that aspect of being able to get to the mind of the customer and then understand what consumer behavior may result from it is where our major successes have come in terms of work we're trying to do in this realm or any of the other realms that AI, ML actually is applicable to. Going down to real-time learning, I know Sandeep and Deepak spoke to this too. I think the challenge that we continue to see in many cases is how much real-time is good enough real-time. This was a topic back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We used to see this question of real-time only being talked about in the high-speed space, which is in talk of airplanes, and you want avionics to be in real time. You want air traffic control communications to be real time. You had some areas that absolutely needed it. Education, for example, at one point in time, didn't need to be all real time. But as I got into the higher ed space, we saw more and more online education come to life, which meant everything they did was going to be in practical real time, not so much near real time, but practical real time. Everybody wanted a response right now. Everybody wanted to know what they did the last minute, the next minute. Students wanted to understand their behavior better. They wanted to know how they played out on the test they just took. They wanted feedback in nanoseconds. And a lot of the instantaneous gratification that we deal with today in the world of social media has arisen out of the fact that we can find out things much faster and quicker than ever before. So real-time learning and optimization, I think, is the subject I spoke about in the previous slide, but it continues to be a challenge because there is practical limits to how fast you can be with things. But nevertheless, real-time learning, I think, is the aspect for data sets to behave and provision the future actions of anything that we are in, whether that be in marketing or education or any other realm for that matter. If you're learning and you're not applying it to the next set of actions, it's like saying we'll do a lost bags report at the end of the month, by which time you've lost 2.5 million bags. So unless you can fix something quickly enough, the damage to the business actually continues to be there. And if it's not a cost side equation, if it's a revenue side equation, the opportunities continue to slip by you. So real-time learning and being able to apply insights as quickly as possible. Go back to this whole hub and streaming concept that Sandeep and Deepak spoke to, which is where perhaps the infrastructure needs to be there for us to disseminate something out to the marketplace. These models are great. You can go cook up an Azure ML model if you have access to the studio, which is a free account. Anyone can go create a model, and literally zero programming required for it. I was playing with the data set yesterday night till midnight, and you don't need programmatic capability to go build out a model. How do you then channel it back into the hands of those who can take action on it, assuming you're not at the level of AI yet? And then how do you enable those insights to be channeled into actions that are meaningful from a business perspective? And finally, also measure feedback from those actions to see if they were really fruitful in achieving what they were meant to achieve. Enriched engagement, this is where this becomes meaningful, because the minute you're able to activate actions in real time, you're able to get a completely different level of engagement. And I think especially today, more than ever before, I think we have shifted into a concept where you see the number of emails you get in your inbox from every company that you've ever touched or dealt with. It's all about remaining engaged with the end users. Nobody's trying to make any revenue right now. There is no one flying anywhere. But at the same time, engagement is key. So they're all engaging and at a very different direct-to-consumer level. The topic of NLP, chatbots, and ML are a great synergy. One example of great synergy that brings in both engagement, outreach and engagement go together, and then the ability for them to engage with you in a meaningful way. Now, chatbots have their own limitations to it. I would be the last one to say that they are the answer to everything. But at the end of the day, if you really need some quick time answers to what you need, and there is no one available, a chatbot can in fact do magic to the customer experience. Most customers, I think we have found in the data sets we play with, require some level of interaction at some point quickly. Nobody wants to wait for 3 days to get a response. So these are able to achieve that, especially if you can speak your questions in. It's very possible that you may get a result that is meaningful to you. So enriching engagement, one synergy example here of how we can accomplish that. The other thing about marketing waste, I came from the higher ed space, enrollment marketing in students, or I'll give you another example in a minute in the aviation space too. We used to find that a whole bulk of marketing material, in fact, would go nowhere. In fact, we at some point in time try to do an analysis of how much of our material actually makes it to the end user. And if it did make it, how many of them open it to even look at it? And if they did look at it, what element of that population really acted upon it and did something with it? Which brought us back to the question of, is it really meaningful? Is that marketing material meaningful? Is that channel meaningful? Is it effective in accomplishing what we set out to accomplish, which is outreach? And so having feedback loops built into the data set allow you for a very different level of engagement on one side, but almost using platforms like what we call as a DMP, allow you to minimize the number of channels, number one, or consolidate them. But on the other hand, also minimize the targets that you're trying to reach, which perhaps have little or no interest in learning about what you're out there to give them. There's always that proportion that's needed, which is where conversion rates, in fact, build rapidly, because now you're able to convert leads as they appear, not from millions down to tens, but from hundreds down to tens, or millions down to 1,000, or millions down to hundreds of thousands. And so this waste concept in marketing, I think, is a good topic to stay focused on in any model. Will the model allow you to reduce waste? Should be a good question to ask. The one part of human behavior, as complicated as the human behavior is, human psychology, as many studies that have happened in the past, I don't think will be ever fully understood. We all carry our own DNA. We're all different people. And so naturally our reactions are based on our circumstances and our past impressions. So naturally, the ability to understand human psychology in its totality will perhaps never be achieved. But the more you know of it, the better your outreach programs would be, the more your marketing would be, the more your consumer targeting would be, the more your personalization could be too. And so how much of it will you understand? How will we actually know what reactions do you evoke in certain people? And this applies even more in a 7 billion planet where across geographies and ethnicities, the diversity is so high that what is understood a certain way in the US is understood totally differently if you go to the UK or you go to East Asia or someplace like that. And so the ability to gather this kind of input, to know the impact of a campaign, you almost go away from a one-size-fits-all type campaign, which allows you to market differently to different people at different places. So detecting patterns, response patterns of human behavior are an essential part of this. The ability for engines to understand it and know when to customize the channel and or the approach, I think is something that we have found to be very valuable. So we go back to human behavior, and Ritesh, are you able to still see my screen, or did I lose the connection?
Can still see your screen, CP.
Okay, very good. I thought because the stop share came up here. That's right. Okay, good. Thank you. So the question that comes, we come back to is, can ML really detect, enough of human behavior patterns? As I said, we'll perhaps never get to 100% of anything, but can it detect enough to make marketing meaningful? Well, the answer already is out there. It is detecting something at least. Otherwise, you and I would not be getting these emails from Amazon telling us of a product that's been launched, or for even Twitter or Instagram to be reviewing everything that people send and curate items for your consumption. That would never happen. So somewhere along the way, it's detecting something that is making it possible for agencies to market to people more directly. How much more can we go? What can happen? I mean, these are all examples of what could potentially be done with intelligence as we gather it. Capturing intelligence, I think, is not a one snapshot in time activity. I think intelligence also needs to get upgraded, just like we build more impressions every day in our own brains. Artificial intelligence needs to do the same thing. And so the ability to continue to detect patterns and build upon that information base is a very important part of what patterns do get collected and how they get transposed into any form of learning and then intelligence thereafter. The one slide I have left here is to talk about limitations without machine learning. I think the fundamental shift that ML can do for the work that we have done in our labs at Fulcrum and or the customers we operate with is that the human mind can only sift through so many channels of input, and then the machines can do better at it, right? So it's not even a comparable league to belong to about how much data it can gather and what it can learn from it. 15, 18 years ago, I was part of a project where kiosks became common at the airports and or the hotel chains, more in the airports. And when you got there, you could swipe your card in and then take your boarding pass and leave and head down the security gates. More and more so, we embarked on a project which at that time was the first of its kind. And United was the first airline to go employ this. It was a very small proof of concept. We thought we'll go do upsell and cross-sell of seats on a plane through the kiosk. Now, within a flash of a second, by the time you swiped your card in and remote it out, we had to go analyze a whole bunch of criteria, determining where had you traveled yesterday, how tired may you be, how likely are you to take an upgrade to first class, at what price point did you buy it last time, how much would you naturally pay for it this time, would you even pick on it if I offered it to you at a certain price point. All of these calculations happened in real time for the most part back then. And we had none of this capability that exists today in detecting data in real time. But we were able to get to a proof of concept that we knew that if we found enough answers about you, that we could sell it to you at a price point that we knew you would pay for it. I mean, maybe it's a late evening flight and you would want a meal on the plane, and the upgrade would get you a meal. So things like that, very subtle things like that would drive human behavior. And when we got to it, it was very, very interesting for us to have gotten to a point where we knew it would happen. Today, of course, it's rampant, it's everywhere. Anytime you go check in, people ask you if you want to go take an upgrade. So it's become commonplace. But machine-driven context, while we never called it these buzzwords back then, it has been around. It's just that it's been more enabled now. So we talked about patterns. I won't repeat it here. I think the ability to crunch numbers at a much faster pace is the big opportunity. And the fact that millions of data points are getting collected from a variety of ways. I didn't even touch upon the topic of Internet of Things, but the fact that we have more collection mechanisms, more sensors out there sensing what you and I do, allows you for a far more richer notion or build up of the human experience. And so the minute you build such a large, vast ambience around the human, now you have a richer data set to go after to get answers to. I'll leave you with this slide. A bunch of applications that are out there. I'm sure most of you have heard through this, but it's a matter of asking ourselves, where in this game do we want to be? What do we want to go experiment on? I think the final point on my presentation is my experience with doing this, and I say this to all our clients, anytime I get a chance for anyone to listen to me, I say start small. I think begin with a simplistic objective, start extremely small and make Lego blocks out of this and build it one piece at a time. I think taking on a very vast problem, a large enough problem that can almost supersede the very consciousness of what we're trying to put together never helps, in fact. So building it in the small and expanding it in an agile way. I don't want to use the word agile from a cliche term standpoint, but building blocks that can help you get to an answer with pieces rather than try to take on a very large problem and deconstruct it. Start small and build up. I think the game becomes a whole lot easier to go build out.